Chapter 21. Alone already had some understanding of why the nobles blatantly ignored him. Because all the rumors have finally died down. Until now, the nobles had feared Alone because they believed he was the mastermind behind taking down Avalon, which had controlled the vast underworld of the East alongside Leo. However, the nobles no longer considered Alone to be the mastermind. After he became a count, he had done nothing significant for several years. The palatial count family, from the time of Alone's grandfather, had always been known as a notorious household that never failed to wield influence in the underworld. The palatial family had consistently dominated the eastern underworld, though the degree of their control varied over time. But ever since Alone became the count, the palatial family no longer exerted influence in the underworld. As a result, the current eastern underworld was now divided and devoured by packs of wolves that used to scavenge for the leftover crumbs outside the domain governed by the palatial count. Furthermore, the power of the palatial count family had also weakened, which was natural. The power they wielded up until now had mostly been fueled by the wealth generated from the underworld. However, since Alone became count, he no longer used money to maintain power. His desired life was not one of grand success in the underworld, but rather, a comfortable and prosperous life that any noble could enjoy. In other words, he had already achieved what he wanted. However, by completely withdrawing from the underworld, rumors began to spread among the nobles. Some speculated that perhaps the current Count Palatial wasn't a mastermind at all, but merely someone who became count by chance. As time passed and Alone continued to do nothing, the rumor gradually became accepted as truth. Eventually, Alone's reputation had devolved into that of a lucky fool who happened to become count in the place of the real mastermind. Of course, there were still a few nobles who remained suspicious of Alone, but even they had begun to agree with the spreading rumors. After all, it didn't make sense that Alone, if he truly had the power to destroy Avalon in a single day, would not have used that power until now. In any case, Alone had somewhat expected this kind of treatment, but he hadn't anticipated that people would go out of their way to mock him like this. Alone looked up at the two nobles, whose faces radiated slyness. He didn't recognize either of them. However, based on the crest engraved on their carriage, it was easy to tell that one was from the Krilda Count family, and the other from the Eidolon Count family. They both look old enough, but isn't this too childish? Alone laughed to himself, as he noted how aged their faces were. He quickly understood why the two nobles had come all this way just to mock him. Ah, I see. This is a gathering of the victims. The palatial family, notorious as they were, had also been a powerful family in the underworld. As a result, they naturally provided benefits to the surrounding families, but also exploited them beyond necessity. The families that were frequently treated like tools were none other than the Krilda Count family and the Eidolon Count family. To summarize the current situation, these families, who had suffered under the palatial family, were now venting their grievances on Alone. Of course, it wasn't Alone but Leo, the first son of the Count family, who had exploited them. In short, Alone had no real reason to be the target of such mockery. But to the two nobles who were eagerly mocking him, what mattered wasn't that he was Alone but that he was the Count of Palatial. All those underworld forces you had, did they vanish because you couldn't manage them properly? Looks like you haven't been taking care of your carriage properly either. Would you like to borrow some money? The two counts, like anonymous trolls commonly found on online communities, made every effort to scratch at Alone. Alone briefly thought, this is kind of annoying, but he chose to follow his reason rather than his instincts. If he were to fight now, he could easily crush the two nobles before him, maybe not slaughter them, but leave them beaten to a pulp. However, doing so would only complicate things. The moment he fought with them, Alone would have to leave the gathering and move separately. And that might lead to unnecessary trouble, like running into bandits. Clearly, responding to their provocations was exactly what they wanted. There's no need to entertain these fools, Alone decided to ignore them. He wasn't stupid enough to fall into such an obvious trap. That day, Alone ate 2 ears of corn, using the jeers from the two counts as background music. Delicious. The roasted corn tasted even better in the slightly chilly weather. It would have been nice to have some butter, Alone mused, staring absent-mindedly at the moonlit sky. For the next few days, the uncomfortable coexistence continued. Every evening, Count Krilda and Count Eidolon would emerge to hurl their mocking remarks, and every time, Alone pretended not to care, brushing off their words as if they were nothing. The one who ignores and the one who tries desperately not to be ignored. Naturally, the one who ignored always won. Alone had deeply internalized one of the life lessons he had learned from a certain online community: don't feed the trolls. At least in this place, no one could beat him at that game. Of course, after several days of this, other nobles began to mock Alone as well, whispering that he lacked dignity as a noble or scoffing at him for staying silent under the insults of Krilda and Eidolon. But despite this, Count Krilda and Count Eidolon, who had been the ones persistently mocking him, were not feeling particularly satisfied. "Damn it," growled Count Krilda. "This is absurd." Count Krilda frowned as he looked at Alone from a distance. Even though they had been mocking him, they were the ones being ignored, which was naturally infuriating. But after a moment of their sour mood, they exchanged low whispers. "Did you confirm?" "Yes, and it seems like he has no additional guards." In truth, the reason the two counts had openly mocked Alone wasn't just to vent their frustrations. It was also to assess his security. Even with an artifact to secretly check, there was nothing. "It's just that foolish brat and that rogue knight sitting next to him. So the rumors are true after all. It seems certain. If he had any forces, he wouldn't be moving around alone. Then we can proceed with the plan." The reason the two counts had been investigating Alone was because they were planning to expand into the underworld. They were well aware that Alone had no interest in the underworld, and that, as a result, it had become overrun by various packs of scavengers. While the rumors about Alone were already widely accepted, the two counts, having been tormented by the Palatial family for so long, wanted to confirm the truth for themselves. They needed to be sure that Alone truly had no power left. After days of checking and confirming that Alone had no personal guards, a smile spread across their faces. "The gods are smiling upon us." Indeed. Who would have thought we'd get a chance to step into the underworld? While most nobles hesitated to enter the underworld, these two were different. Having once acted as lackeys for the Palatial Count family, they knew full well just how astronomical the wealth circulating within the underworld was. They were well aware of how sweet the taste of power from that realm could be. Now that it seemed the Palatial family had truly become a hollow shell, the two spoke excitedly, as if they had already conquered the underworld. In truth, it wasn't impossible for them to seize control of the underworld if they joined forces. After all, the reason they hadn't been able to do so before was not due to a lack of power, but because they had feared the Palatial Count family. Thus, after their lengthy discussion, they turned their attention back to Alone. "If we take control of the back, we should give that fool a gift, don't you think?" "That's an excellent idea. There's a limit to how much one can ignore others. He's probably acting this way because he doesn't understand how dangerous the world can be. We'll have to teach him. Count Krilda has such a fine personality." The two counts, wearing fishy grins that were far from noble, as if they had done nothing wrong, were confident that the moment they had been waiting for would come soon. Just as the two were about to rejoin the camp where the other nobles were gathered after finishing their private conversation. Monsters! The event happened suddenly. Under the cover of darkness, monsters appeared. It was as if they had been lying in ambush, waiting silently, until a soldier spotted them by chance and shouted. At that moment, monstrous cries echoed from within the forest, as if on cue. Immediately, the mercenaries and knights, as if rehearsed, drew their weapons to protect the nobles. And then, "Wizard, give us light!" A wizard, extravagantly brought along by a noble purely for boasting purposes at this grand church event, responded to the knight's command and cast an orb of light into the sky. In an instant, the mercenaries and knights, who had been noisy just moments earlier, fell silent. What they saw when the light from the wizard illuminated the dark forest were goblins. Goblins are commonly found in forests. With the strength of a child, they are not dangerous monsters for anyone other than rookie mercenaries. Though the rusty swords and bows they wield can be dangerous, they pose little threat to seasoned mercenaries and knights. Goblins only become troublesome when their numbers swell, but even with dozens of them, they can still be easily driven off. However, This is insane. If their numbers are enough to fill the forest before them, then they are undoubtedly a threat to the knights and mercenaries. Moreover, what heightened the tension for the knights was that the goblins before them were far from ordinary. What on earth is that? A knight's voice, laced with both fear and confusion, was directed at the sight of the goblins. The problem wasn't just that they were goblins, it was their grotesque appearance. Purple crystals were growing all over their bodies, including their heads, as if they had been afflicted by some kind of plague. To make matters worse. Wait, isn't that Mark? Among the horde of goblins, the body of a seasoned mercenary who had been assigned to external surveillance for precautionary measures was being devoured savagely. Kirk. In the hands of a massive goblin was what remained of Mark's body. The mercenaries who saw this sight. This can't be happening. Felt a rising wave of fear within them. Mark, the mutilated corpse in front of them, was a veteran mercenary who could easily handle dozens of goblins on his own. The fact that he had been killed without even being able to report the approach of this massive goblin horde suggested one thing to the mercenaries. The mutated goblins before them were anything but ordinary. The knights, who were holding their weapons alongside the mercenaries, also recognized that this was a dire situation. Even if there were only hundreds of goblins, this fight would be incredibly unfavorable for the knights. Individually they might manage, but the knights had nobles to protect now. And goblins were cunning monsters, capable of easily exploiting that vulnerability. While the mercenaries seemed to be paralyzed with fear at the sight of the goblin's strange appearance and Mark's death, the knights who could sense magic were aware of something more. They realized that the goblins before them were imbued with magic power. Even a small amount of magic within a monster significantly enhances its physical abilities, and the knights understood this well. Just as the knights were grimacing at the goblins' bizarre howls and their impending charge. Thud! A wall of stones and rubble suddenly rose from the midst of the goblin horde. All eyes were instantly drawn to it. The wizard, who had cast the light spell, recognized that the wall was a rock wall, a third-tier spell. As the translucent barrier of a second-tier shield formed beyond the wall, the knight's expressions shifted from despair to confusion. The goblin's malicious stares were now entirely focused on the wall. Enhance! A calm voice echoed through the air. And then, compress! With a loud cracking sound, the translucent sphere rapidly shrank, distorting the stone wall as it collapsed inward. Thud, thud. In the ensuing silence, the sound of footsteps drew the attention of the knights and mercenaries to one direction. A man was approaching. Even in this life-threatening situation, he appeared completely unfazed, walking with an indifferent expression. The nobles and knights quickly realized that the man was Count Palacio. Vacuum. As soon as his lips moved again, the round shield transformed into a rough, rock-like shape, about the size of a soccer ball you might find by the roadside. And then, returned to origin. With Alone's final words, the bracelet on his wrist began to emit a faint gray light. Boom! The compressed stones exploded outward like a shotgun blast, tearing dozens of goblins to pieces. It all happened in an instant. The nobles, knights, and mercenaries stood in stunned silence, their mouths agape as they watched the magic-infused goblins get shredded into mere lumps of flesh. Among them, Count Krilda and Count Edelin's eyes widened as if they were about to tear apart. With all eyes now on Alone, he simply said, "Stop standing there in a daze and get ready." His voice was calm as he looked ahead. The knights and mercenaries, as if mesmerized, raised their swords. The fear that had been spreading in their hearts had, as if by magic, vanished entirely. Chapter 22. The battle with the goblins ended in victory. Thanks to the knights and mercenaries responding calmly, the front lines held strong, and Alone's magic once again destroyed a detachment of enemies who were moving to attack the nobles from behind, quickly tilting the battle in their favor. Of course, with hundreds of mutated goblins, there were casualties, but the number was small given the scale of the battle. The final blow came when a knight pierced the head of the last goblin, ending the battle completely. As soon as the soldiers confirmed the battle was over, they sighed in deep relief and turned their gazes toward Alone, who was looking down at the goblin corpses. Despite having just fought a life-or-death struggle, he remained expressionless, as if the battle had left no impact on him, causing the mercenaries to look at him with awe. They couldn't forget the sight of Alone turning dozens of goblins into mere chunks of meat without even changing his expression. However, while the knights and mercenaries admired Alone, he was thinking, "I nearly died in a single strike." Though his face showed no sign, inside he was working hard to calm his wildly racing heart. Despite bearing the insignia of the impure, which allowed him to cast 3 times more spells than usual, after using walls and shields twice each, he had been reduced to a mere mortal due to the limitations of his mana capacity. It's a good thing the knights won, he thought. Though the odds of the knights and mercenaries losing were slim, even against mutated goblins, when he had lost all means of self-defense, he had felt a desperate fear. Perhaps I should have just dropped out earlier. No, it was a good thing I stayed close. But more importantly, Alone praised his past self for acting rationally and, having calmed his heart, turned his gaze to the goblin before him, his expression growing serious. He knew all too well the significance of the purple amethyst emerging from the goblin's body. Why, a divine descent! This was a strange phenomenon that occurred among the monsters of the continent when an outer god tried to descend upon the world. The monsters affected by divine descent became more ferocious and physically stronger. While the current group of soldiers could handle the monsters they would encounter on their journey to the Duke's territory, Alone was concerned about the fact that the divine descent had occurred at all. The phenomenon meant that an outer god would soon descend upon the land. Typically, such gods could not descend unless one of the 5 great sins manifested, but now, even these borderland gods were about to arrive. This can't be good. The descent of outer gods was a grave matter for Alone. While not as catastrophic as the great sins, if these gods started rampaging, entire kingdoms could vanish easily. There were only 6 kingdoms on the continent excluding the Empire, meaning a 1/3 chance that his future plans would be destroyed. In fact, if he were lucky enough to even be able to think about his future at that point, he would consider it fortunate. Alone's expression grew serious as he stared at the goblin. However, there were others who looked even more serious than Alone, so serious, in fact, that their expressions seemed to suggest they had lost everything. Those individuals were Count Krilda and Count Eidolon. A few days after the appearance of the mutated goblin, with only 1 day left until their arrival at the Duke's estate, Alone experienced 2 changes in that short time. One was that the nobles, who once looked at him with blatant contempt and ridicule, especially when Counts Krilda and Eidolon made their snide comments, no longer displayed such expressions. The second change was, "Count Palacio, this is some meat I brought from my estate. Would you like to try it? Count, if it pleases you, I could offer some support to your domain. What do you think?" Count Krilda and Count Eidolon, who had spent the past few days mocking Alone, were now fawning over him, trying to curry favor. The 2 counts, who now seemed ready to give Alone anything he wanted, clung to his side, flattering him with servile smiles, while Alone remained indifferent. But the counts were desperate, truly desperate. The display of power Alone had shown just days ago was too strong to dismiss as mere luck in claiming the title of Count Palacio. Moreover, they still remembered what the 3rd-tier mage, whom Baron Aman had brought to flaunt his wealth, said that night, that Alone's magic was undoubtedly beyond a 2nd-tier level. Upon hearing that, both counts began to reconsider the rumors circulating in society, wondering if they were wrong about Alone. While there were still some unresolved doubts, that no longer mattered. What was important was that the 2 counts had realized Alone was hiding a power strong enough to not need protection. This meant the power that had supposedly wiped out Avalon in a single day, the power held by Count Palacio, could be real. With this realization, their only option was to quickly win Alone's favor. While some might argue that it would be better to investigate the situation thoroughly before making any moves, this didn't apply to those who knew the Palacio family well. The 2 counts, having witnessed firsthand the brutality of the Palacio family's notorious behavior, knew how cruel they could be. Although Alone, the 3rd son, had never shown such behavior himself, the counts were convinced that Alone shared the family's cruel and ruthless nature. After all, the Palacio family had been full of miscreants since his grandfather's time. Thanks to this, Alone had enjoyed a luxurious lifestyle in recent days. Instead of sweet potatoes and corn, he ate meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and the wine they occasionally brought along was also excellent. However, despite receiving these gifts for several consecutive days, Alone's expression did not soften, still preoccupied with thoughts of the goblin from a few days ago. Who could it be? No matter how much Alone pondered, no clear answer emerged. The divine descent was merely a sign that an outer god was about to descend, and there was no way to know exactly which god or when and where it would occur. Although it was meaningless to dwell on it, Alone couldn't help but worry, knowing that his future plans could be completely ruined in an instant. He could go from being a noble to a commoner in the blink of an eye, which was why he couldn't stop thinking about it. I'll have to gather as much information as I can once I reach the estate. As he thought this, he glanced at the nobles beside him, who were eagerly trying to make up for their previous behavior, even at the expense of their pride. He was once again reminded of the Palatial family's infamous reputation. I didn't think they would react this way over just a slight doubt about a rumor. As Alone watched the Count's desperate display, he realized how deeply the rumors about his family had affected them. However, despite understanding their fear, he had no intention of easing their anxieties. Alone considered himself cool-headed, but he also had a petty side. The Count's performance finally came to an end when Alone arrived at the Duke Roteger's estate. As soon as Alone arrived at the Duke Roteger's estate, what greeted him was an absurdly large mansion. No, multiple mansions. How many mansions are there inside this estate? Of course, the rich would have this many, he thought, as he noticed the variety of mansions, almost as if someone with diverse tastes in interior design had collected them. Alone soon realized that all these mansions belonged to the Duke's concubines, causing him to shake his head in disbelief. How does his body even survive? He wondered briefly, but upon arriving at the ballroom in the middle of a grand party, he was once again shocked. Everything he saw screamed wealth. Even the wine glasses, which one wouldn't normally pay much attention to, were rimmed with gold. The chandeliers, made entirely of gold, made Alone feel the urge to steal one and sell it as he wandered around the ballroom. Naturally, the ballroom was filled with many nobles. As expected, the Duke of Roteger, who appeared incredibly thin, was there chatting with numerous nobles. Alone didn't bother trying to join their conversations. It wasn't hard to guess that there would be no benefit in doing so, especially in this ballroom, which felt even worse than the previous one he had attended. Instead of mingling, Alone decided to stand nearby, snacking on food and eavesdropping on the nobles' conversations. After all, his servant, Evan, had already gone off to contact the Information Guild as soon as they arrived at the estate. As Alone savored a dessert that resembled an egg tart alongside some wine, he overheard an interesting piece of news from the nobles' conversation. Baron Daldoran, have you heard the news? What news do you mean? You know, the rumor that Duke Altia and Count Zenonia not only formed an alliance but are also trying to establish a faction. That rumor? Yes, I've heard about it. The two nobles, acting as though they were discussing some great secret, moved to a corner and began whispering. However, with his enhanced hearing, Alone could easily pick up their conversation. But is that true? I couldn't believe they had allied in the first place. If they really form a faction, they could overpower all the current factions combined. Exactly. It might be something unprecedented. Alone was a little surprised upon hearing this, but his expression didn't change much. Even if such rumors were true, he didn't think those two would be able to maintain their alliance for long. As he pondered this, Alone couldn't help but widen his eyes in surprise at the delicious taste of the egg tart in his mouth, nodding in approval. This is good. Without hesitation, he grabbed another and popped it into his mouth. However, just then, the conversation he was listening to took an even more interesting turn. But that's not the real issue. What do you mean? Is there an even bigger rumor? Of course, I wouldn't have started if there wasn't. What is it then? This is something I heard very discreetly, so don't go spreading it around. I've heard that neither Duke Altia nor Count Zenonia is the leader of this faction. What? Then who is? Count Palacio. Count Palacio? Yes, the leader of the faction is said to be Count Palacio. Is that true? Of course. Do you think I would lie about something like this? What? Hearing this, Alone instinctively turned to look at the nobles discussing the secret, and found himself gaping in shock at what they had just revealed. Chapter 23. The cold northern lands, a place where no living being should be able to survive, was gripped by an unrelenting, life-draining frost. In this bleak, cursed land, painted eternally in shades of gray by the relentless blizzard, a man had fallen. Where his right arm should have been, a crimson stain of blood marked the spot, and his left eye socket lay empty. This man was none other than one of the 8 barbarian chieftains, the great Klakan, now awaiting death after his defeat at the hands of the cowardly knights of Caliban. Yet even in his final moments, his eyes were filled with rage. "Those dishonorable dogs!" he cursed, but not because of his defeat. To the barbarians, death in battle was a glorious end, a noble fate. Klakan's fury stemmed from the dishonorable way he was struck down, caught in an ambush, tricked by the knight's deceitful challenge to a duel. Cough! Blood spilled from Klakan's mouth as his world grew dim. The gray landscape blurred, and his ears gradually stopped hearing the bitter winds. Despite his anger, his mind slowly began to sink into darkness. Just as everything was about to fade into nothingness, Klakan whispered the name of the great god. Althultus. At that very moment, time seemed to stop. The dim, fading vision cleared, the harsh northern wind blew in his ears once again, and his mind, slipping into unconsciousness, began to rise. "Child of blood," a voice echoed. "Call my name. Call upon the great name that you worshipped. Call upon my name, and I shall grant you what you desire." As if commanded by a divine force, Klakan, entranced, murmured, "Althultus." And in that moment, the god smiled. Somehow, I became the hidden mastermind of Asteria after waking up. After hearing something that seemed to fit such a title, Alone closed his gaping mouth and mumbled to himself. However, the sweetness he had felt just moments before was completely gone. What kind of nonsense is this? A flurry of question marks swirled in Alone's mind as he tried to comprehend the rumors he had just heard. It made no sense to him. If he had been associating closely with Duke Altea or Count Zenonia, both of whom were currently forming new factions, he might have understood the basis for such rumors. However, the issue was that Alone had never once met either of the two nobles. He had only seen Duke Altea once when she was still a young lady at a ball, and as for Lady Zenonia, he had encountered her but had never met the Count himself. In other words, the rumor lacked plausibility, to the point of being entirely baseless. Alone, who had been slowly moving his lips while deep in thought, soon concluded that the notion of him exchanging secret talks with other nobles was nothing more than an absurd, groundless rumor. After all, suspicions could only arise if there was a pre-existing relationship. But since Alone had no connection whatsoever with those individuals, he didn't even feel the need to entertain any doubt. So, just as Alone reached for a cookie next to the egg tart, a voice called out, "Count Palacio!" Alone turned his head toward the voice and looked beside him. There stood a man dressed in expensive clothing, his face full of mockery. Who is this guy? Alone briefly scanned the man. With his long, curly hair draped to one side, it was easy to tell that the man's character was twisted in a way that was different from the Palacio family, but Alone couldn't gather any more information than that. At the very least, Alone had no information on him in his mind. "Oh, I haven't introduced myself. I am Carmine, the third son of Duke Comelin of the Ashkelon Kingdom." As soon as he noticed Alone didn't recognize him, Carmine's expression briefly faltered before he introduced himself. Alone paused in confusion, then nodded in understanding. After all, he had heard that foreign nobles occasionally visited the grand church where most of Asteria's nobility gathered. "Count Palacio," Alone responded with a polite greeting. "I've heard of you. You were fortunate enough to become a count, weren't you?" Alone blinked in surprise at Carmine's immediate mocking tone. He had suspected from the start that this wasn't a friendly encounter based on the man's demeanor, but he hadn't expected him to launch straight into open ridicule, as if he had no sense of tact or intelligence. Just as Alone was processing this, another voice interrupted from a different direction. "Excuse me, but what are you saying right now?" Turning toward the new voice, Alone found a familiar face, unlike with Carmine. "Marquis Mardinho?" Alone recognized him not by his face but by the emblem emblazoned on his chest, and the fact that he had the distinct appearance of a middle-aged man. Are you insulting a noble of the Asteria kingdom right now? Alone's face showed bewilderment at this sudden and unexpected defense. Carmine, the third son of Duke Comelin of the Ashkelon kingdom, was not in a particularly good mood that day. There were many reasons for his foul mood, but the biggest one was that the marriage proposal with the fifth daughter of Duke Loteger, which he had worked hard to arrange, wasn't going well. Of course, the reason the proposal fell apart was purely due to Carmine's childish behavior and antics that made him appear immature. He had made the foolish mistake of evaluating the appearance of other noblewomen in front of the fifth daughter herself. As expected of a spoiled child raised without discipline, instead of acknowledging his mistake, Carmine became even more displeased when the lady suggested reconsidering the proposal. If this had not been the kingdom of Asteria, a close ally, or if it hadn't been Duke Loteger, with whom numerous secret dealings were being conducted, Carmine would have already flipped the situation upside down. Of course, on the flip side, Carmine had no idea that the only reason Duke Loteger was turning a blind eye to his behavior was because of the very secretive relationship he had with Duke Comelin. In any case, with his mood soured, Carmine had come to the ball, hoping to lift his spirits, when he spotted Count Palacio and decided to pick a fight. There was only one reason he started the altercation: to vent his already foul mood. Of course, there were plenty of servants and knights around him who could have been ignored or ridiculed, but Carmine didn't find any pleasure in toying with them. It wasn't that his character was admirable, but rather that playing with toys he could easily destroy at will didn't offer him any amusement. For nobles like him, those not of noble birth were treated as no more than that. In that sense, Count Palacio was a perfect stress reliever for Carmine. From what Carmine had heard, Count Palacio was just a clueless boy who had luckily become a count, with no close allies among the nobility. Though even a rascal like him understood that this was not his own territory, he had carefully thought through who he could safely target without any consequences. And so, as soon as he saw Palacio, he initiated the confrontation. Do you realize how disrespectful it is to insult a noble of the kingdom of Asteria? That's not what The kingdom of Ashkelon has been our ally for a long time, but that was based on mutual respect. Have the people of Ashkelon forgotten what respect means? No, that's not. So, are you saying that Duke Comelin of Ashkelon views Asteria in such a light? Absolutely not. Then why are you addressing a noble so disrespectfully without having even properly succeeded to your own title? Carmine's face twisted in confusion. Contrary to the rumors he had heard, the moment he picked a fight with Count Palacio, the other nobles started to rally around him, chastising Carmine. As his face grew more bewildered, Carmine turned his gaze toward Alone, hoping for support, but even Alone was staring at the situation in a state of confusion, his typical expressionless face now mixed with perplexity and bewilderment. What is this situation? Carmine then looked at the three nobles defending Alone. One was Marquis Mardinho, another was Duke Loteger, and the last was Count Palin. Alone easily recognized them, not only because of their crests but also because they were highly influential figures within Asteria. Marquis Mardinho was a prominent figure among the royalist faction. Duke Loteger, on the other hand, was a major figure within the aristocratic faction. As for Count Palin, he maintained political neutrality, but that very position had allowed him to accumulate considerable power. Even if Alone had no interest in politics or noble affairs, it was impossible for any noble in Asteria not to know who they were. Is Duke Comelin truly looking down on us? That's not the case. Then why did you speak so disrespectfully to Count Palacio? I've been disrespectful. Disrespect isn't the issue here. The point is, why did you make such condescending remarks to Count Palacio? Watching the nobles closing in on Carmine with their well-practiced political maneuvering, Alone, who had never been involved in politics, suddenly recognized the situation. I'm sorry. Does apologizing end your military service? I'm sorry. I asked, does apologizing end your military service? This is it. As this vivid memory from over 10 years ago flashed through Alone's mind, he unknowingly began to sweat. I've been disrespectful. Carmine, unable to endure the pressure from the nobles any longer, fled the ballroom as if in retreat. As soon as he left, the nobles quickly approached Alone and started speaking to him. Count Palacio, are you alright? I'm fine, but... Alone looked at the three nobles, wondering why they were being so kind to him. However, look at that. It seems they've already heard the rumors. Seems like the rumors are true if even those big shots are getting involved. If Duke Altea and Count Zenonia get involved in politics, they'll be unstoppable. But look at the other nobles, they seem confused. It's still a secret, so be careful what you say. Where on earth do you hear things like this? There are ways. Thanks to his heightened hearing, Alone overheard the hushed conversation of the noble who had been secretly whispering earlier. It was only then that he began to piece together what was happening and realize how absurd the situation was. Now that I think about it, I haven't had the chance to talk with you, Count. I understand, though, as you're probably very busy. Marquis Mardinho, speaking as if he knew everything, chuckled and continued the conversation. Alone began seriously contemplating whether or not he should clarify that the rumors were baseless nonsense. After all, not doing so could lead to unnecessary complications later on. But then again, speaking up now might make the situation even more awkward. As Alone mulled over what to do. By the way, I heard you're studying magic, Count. Is that true? That's correct. Then I thought I might give you a small gift. Among the artifacts I acquired after clearing out some orc hordes, there's one that stores magical energy for later use. How does that sound? Now that you mention it, I also prepared a little gift. Silence followed as Alone listened to the nobles. That day, Alone ended up receiving 2 magical artifacts and 5 mana restoration potions from the 3 nobles. Meanwhile, as these influential figures gathered around Alone, leaving the other nobles bewildered, Count Krilda and Count Eidolon closed their eyes tightly in despair, thinking, "Did we mess with the wrong person? This is really bad." 4 days after the banquet began, as Alone's collection of spoils steadily grew. An outer god descended in the north? Yes, that's the information I received. Apparently, the purple crystal is also connected to the outer god, but they say they don't know for sure, as the information comes from ancient texts. Regardless, it's thrown Caliban into chaos. With only 2 days left in the banquet, Alone, having gathered this intel through the Information Guild, started contemplating something. And then, without hesitation, he made a decision. Evan. Yes. Once the banquet is over, complete the tasks we need to finish, and then we're heading straight to Caliban. He had made up his mind without any doubt. Chapter 24. Suddenly? Wait, more importantly, in Caliban. Evan, wearing a deeply confused expression, spoke while thinking for a moment. Then, as if realizing something, he hesitantly opened his mouth. Don't tell me you're planning to go to the north. Evan spoke, recalling that Caliban was the closest country to where the northern barbarians resided. I'll explain on the way. Just prepare first. The information I mentioned earlier, it's accurate, right? If you're talking about the person we discussed last time, yes. The Information Guild confirmed they're in that village. Evan, speaking with an anxious expression. Then we'll stop there before heading straight to Caliban. But at Alone's firm statement, Evan, with a mixture of curiosity and resignation in his eyes, looked at him for a moment before leaving the room to follow orders. Ha! Alone let out a deep sigh, covering his face with his hand as if just thinking about it was exhausting. It was because the descent of an outer god was akin to a massive disaster that he desperately wished would never happen. An outer god. These beings, known by various names across the continent of Psychedelia, were evils that, much like the 5 great sins, merely descending into the world brought calamity. For Alone, their descent alone was enough to shatter his future plans completely. Once they began rampaging in earnest, they could easily destroy entire kingdoms. Of course, with 6 kingdoms on the continent, the odds of being affected were about 1/3. But still, even thinking rationally, there was a 33.3% chance that he would lose his noble title and end up living as a beggar. In fact, by that point, living as a beggar might even be fortunate. If an outer god attacked Asteria, his chances of surviving were slim to none. If, by some small chance, the outer god destroyed 2 other kingdoms instead of Asteria, the situation might improve slightly, but it wouldn't be ideal. the collapse of two kingdoms would lead to the rapid fall of the United Kingdoms, and the surviving kingdoms would fight each other madly over worthless land tainted by the powers of the otherworld. With tens of thousands of casualties and over a dozen heroes already lost to the outer gods, the remaining kingdoms would naturally weaken, and in the end, the Empire would devour them all. In short, no matter how you looked at it, if an outer god descended upon the United Kingdoms, Alone would have to give up his noble title. And in some ways, the latter scenario might be even worse. While the former would end quickly, the latter would drag him into a full-scale war. Sure, some might suggest the United Kingdoms could band together in unity during such a crisis. But having played this game long enough and having seen hundreds of scenarios, Alone could confidently shake his head. In every scenario where an outer god or one of the 5 great sins destroyed even a single kingdom, the dissolution of the United Kingdoms was inevitable. Other small details might change, but the collapse of the Union never did. In other words, for Alone, to prevent his life plans from crumbling, he had to stop the outer god before it reached the kingdom. Humph. As soon as Alone heard that an outer god had descended, he knew he had to act immediately. He had a plan. I have to resolve this within 2 months. When an outer god first descends to the mortal world, it cannot fully wield its power as an avatar and requires a 2-month stabilization period before it can awaken as a sage god and fully access its abilities. Thus, there was a small window of time before it became a sage god, during which stopping it would be somewhat easier. Though, even before becoming a sage god, it wasn't exactly weak. He quietly recalled a part of his mind, where all the game-related information, except for what was necessary, had gathered dust. If it's the North, then it would be the god of duels, Altultus. Before becoming a sage god, he wouldn't be able to use formation attacks, so that's a bit of a relief. But normally, to purely suppress him with force, you'd absolutely need at least 5 sword masters and 1 archmage. Alone silently shook his head. Of course, gathering that kind of power was impossible in the current situation. However, despite this, Alone's expression didn't falter. Ever since the moment the monsters were possessed by a god, he had half expected this situation to come. He already had a plan to eliminate the outer god. I'm not sure if it will go according to plan, but there was no time to dwell on such things. After thinking this far, Alone opened a drawer in the inn where he was staying, took out some stationery, and immediately began writing a letter. 10 minutes later. I guess I should prepare a gift as well. After finishing the letter, which was addressed to Master Knight Deus Michaelian in Caliban, Alone stood up. That late afternoon, 2 days before the banquet, Count Palacio left Duke Roteger's castle. That night, at Duke Altia's rarely visited residence, which Duke Roteger had kindly offered for her use, she finally arrived and was having a conversation with a man. You're saying Count Palacio has already left? Yes, that's correct. When the man, Marquis Mardarnio, nodded, Duke Altia, or Loria, spoke again. So, how did it go? Fortunately, he accepted the gift well. At the Marquis's words, Altia smiled. That's a relief. For nobles, gifts are generally ceremonial and don't hold much significance. However, that only applies to trivial gifts. Expensive items, like relics, always carry deeper meanings. In Marquis Mardarnio's case, the gift he presented to the head of a new faction held a single message: "May I join your faction?" Of course, directly asking would be more straightforward, but noble society is all about appearances. For example, if someone were to ask directly and be rejected, it would be a blow to their dignity. That's why both the giver and the receiver communicate symbolically through what could essentially be called a bribe, making it easier for both parties to handle. Accepting the gift means approval. Rejecting it means refusal. Of course, Count Palacio, or Alone, knew nothing of this. He had only attended a ball once in his life, had no friends, and his father, who died of an overdose, left him ignorant of such matters. As a result, Alone simply thought, even if they realize later, it's not like I'll see them often, and it'd be awkward to ask for it back after accepting, right? With that in mind, he readily took the gift, fully intending to keep it. Now we can officially align our interests. It's an honor. How did the others fare? Those who pledged their allegiance also accepted the gifts. Thanks to Alone's ignorance and his willingness to keep the gifts, Althea was able to gain the support of the nobles she had given prior notice to. Then we can start making serious moves now. With a small smile, she began preparing for the true formation of her faction. Exactly 1 week after Alone left Duke Roteger's estate, he arrived in Parkran, a small village in the northern part of the Kingdom of Ashkelon, located some distance from the Roteger estate. Alone had come here for one reason. Hello? It was to meet the protagonist of this dark fantasy roguelike game, Psychedelia. Do you know who I am? No. The reason Alone wanted to meet Eliban, the protagonist of the game, even though the 5 great sins had already been eliminated and the protagonist was no longer essential, was simple. Even without the 5 great sins, the protagonist would still become famous, and Alone judged that it wouldn't hurt to win his favor early on. Especially now, with an outer god having descended, Alone wanted the protagonist to grow quickly. So he came loaded with items to aid Eliban's early growth. Eliban, right? Yes, that's me. As Alone watched the boy speak with a bright smile, so cheerful that anyone might find it refreshing, he thought to himself, he's almost too good-looking for a guy. But well, he looks just like the illustration. In Psychedelia, the player's choices allowed them to freely adjust the protagonist's gender. That thought briefly crossed Alone's mind, but then he felt a strange sense of dissonance. Was the protagonist always like this? Since Psychedelia was a dark fantasy game, he remembered that while Eliban's personality was lively compared to other dark fantasy characters, he didn't recall him being this bright. He felt a bit puzzled. But that feeling passed quickly. Take this. Alone naturally pulled out a few gold coins from his pocket and handed them to the boy. Huh? For me? Eliban's eyes widened in disbelief as he received the gold coins, which were enough to support a typical household for 2 months. But Alone didn't stop there. He soon began handing over one item after another, explaining the gifts he had prepared for Eliban over the past week. After a lengthy explanation and handing over all the items he had collected, Eliban, with a puzzled look, asked, "But why are you giving me all this?" Seeing Eliban's confused expression, Alone hesitated for a moment before replying. "It's an investment." "An investment?" "Yeah. You're going to be big one day." In truth, Alone was hoping that Eliban might deal with any future outer gods for him, but he didn't voice that part. "I'm Count Palacio," Alone added, letting Eliban know the name of the benefactor he should be grateful to when he succeeded, before climbing into his carriage without hesitation. "Thank you, Count." "No, Sir Count!" Eliban, looking bewildered by the sudden meeting and parting, soon watched the departing carriage and gave a respectful farewell. Shortly afterward, "I can roughly guess what you're trying to do, but isn't this all a bit rushed?" Evan remarked, watching how quickly Alone had passed all the gifts to the protagonist. "We don't have time. Besides, he's smart enough to figure it out." Alone spoke while recalling Eliban's backstory. He had considered staying in the village for a few days to build rapport with Eliban, but unfortunately, time wasn't on his side. So he made this choice, and Evan nodded in agreement. "Yeah, well, he does seem incredibly talented. I mean, for a kid, his magic power is really strong." "Huh? Magic power? Yeah, you didn't notice? It looked like his magic was oozing out of him. Plus, even though he's dressed like a village boy, it seemed like he had an artifact with him too." Hearing Evan's words, Alone recalled his memory of Eliban. Come to think of it, I did sense a bit of magic power. But wasn't Eliban supposed to be just a random village boy before starting his adventure? Recalling the game's starting setup, Alone tilted his head in confusion. It seemed odd for Eliban to have magic power and an artifact at this stage, but Alone brushed it off. Well, he's the protagonist, so I guess he can have a bit more talent than usual. With that thought, Alone stopped worrying about Eliban. He had given everything he could, and if the protagonist became stronger, it would only benefit him. After all, Eliban was one of the few characters with a kind heart in this cruel dark fantasy world. Because of that. How long will it take to reach Caliban from here? About another week. 10 days at most if we're delayed. I wish I could get some help. Alone listened to Evan's words as he headed toward Caliban. Meanwhile, at the large mansion in the south of Caliban, Deus, who had returned from the northern expedition and was resting, was preparing to leave for the north again the next day because of foreign news. After reading the letter, "Vice Captain?" "Yes. The northern expedition is postponed for 2 weeks." He immediately gave the order. "May I ask the reason for the postponement?" At the vice captain's question, Deus fell silent for a moment. "Soon, a benefactor will arrive." He muttered those words. Chapter 25. Carmine, the third son of Duke Comelin, had been in a foul mood for the past week. While the recent broken engagement was part of the reason, what was really getting under his skin was Count Palacio. At the latest banquet, he tried to relieve his stress by antagonizing Count Palacio, only to end up publicly humiliated. Of course, it was entirely Carmine's fault. If he hadn't made inappropriate comments about the appearance of another noblewoman, the engagement talks would have gone smoothly. And if he hadn't provoked Count Palacio, he wouldn't have faced such disgrace. However, Carmine had completely forgotten that he had instigated the conflict. He only focused on the humiliation he had suffered, replaying the incident over and over in his mind. It was the first time in his life he had experienced such shame. After all, as the son of Duke Comelin, a cornerstone of the kingdom, he had never faced such humiliation before, and that moment had left a deep mark on his memory. For about 10 days, Carmine would often grind his teeth while recalling the event. As soon as he arrived at the Comelin estate, he spoke, as if making a decision. "Hey! Yes, young master? Where did that bastard say he was going?" "The last I heard, Count Palacio had some business in Caliban." Without listening to the night finish, Carmine hurried into his room and opened a desk drawer. Inside were numerous crystal balls. He picked the one from the far right and immediately took out a magic stone from his pocket, bringing it close to the crystal ball. As the crystal began to glow brightly, time passed, and the light started to dim. "Well, if it isn't my friend Carmine," a voice came from the crystal. "I'll get straight to the point. I need your help." Carmine spoke while holding the magic crystal. You need help? With what?" "Count Palacio. He's probably on his way right now. I need you to deal with him." "Deal with him? You mean Count Palacio?" The person on the other end, confused by the situation, asked again. "You don't have to kill him. Just leave him half dead." There was a brief silence from the man in the crystal before he spoke. "Even so, that's a bit. I'll give you 5. "What?" "If you take care of him, I'll give you 5 more. You need them, don't you? To get stronger." "Ha!" The man in the crystal let out a dry laugh at Carmine's words. "Are you serious? You can get me 5 of those? If you get the job done properly, it's no problem." The man in the crystal remained silent for a moment. "You can do it, can't you?" "Ha!" Then, as if amused, the man chuckled. "My friend, you know me too well. You always know exactly how to get to me. Are you going to do it or not? All I have to do is take care of him, right?" "Yeah. As brutally as possible." "Wow, he must have really pissed you off to ask this much. Anyway, got it. I'll take care of it and contact you once it's done." With those words, the communication ended. The room fell silent, as if the conversation that just took place had never happened. But there was one difference. A sly grin spread across Carmine's face. Did he really think I'd let him off after publicly humiliating me? That was the only thought occupying his mind. "Have we finally arrived?" "Looks like it." It had been about 2 weeks since Alone met Eliban, the protagonist of this world. Looking out at the capital city of Kurdum in the distance, Alone shifted his gaze to the back of the carriage. Various gifts were loaded there, all meant for Deus, the person they were about to meet. "Ugh, I'm exhausted," yawned Evan from beside him, clearly tired as he glanced at the gifts. Alone, too, felt the fatigue, just as Evan said. "Long journeys are always tiring. It would have been a lot more peaceful if we hadn't gone to that labyrinth-like place." Their tiredness was not only from the long journey, but also because Alone had made several stops in the past week. "It was necessary." That was Alone's only reply to Evan. In truth, the reason they had made all those stops on the way to Caliban was to prepare for the upcoming battle with Outer God. The lotus-shaped necklace now hanging around Alone's neck, which hadn't been there 2 weeks ago, was part of those preparations. Ignoring Evan's gaze, Alone changed the subject. Deus has returned from his expedition, right? Yes, he should be here. Alone fell silent for a moment before asking. He'll meet with me, won't he? I'm sure he will. Evan replied, though Alone remained slightly skeptical. It's not just about meeting him, the real challenge is getting him to agree to my request. Alone had provided Deus with a great deal of financial support over the years and even saved him from what could have been a disastrous situation. In terms of pure cause and effect, Alone was definitely in the position of a benefactor. But realistically, from Deus's perspective, Alone was probably just a faceless person who had generously spent money to help him from afar. After all, Alone had never actually met Deus in person. Without any direct interaction, it was hard to expect any real closeness, so now that he was finally in Kurdum, Alone couldn't help but feel a little anxious. I can only hope the gifts will win him over. As Alone mulled over his thoughts, they finally reached the northern gate of Kurdum, where they joined the line for inspection, just like any other travelers entering the capital. Even though he was a noble in the Asteria kingdom, when traveling abroad, inspections were mandatory for everyone. After briefly explaining his identity to the soldier conducting the inspection, Alone waited for Evan to finish as the line of carriages slowly moved forward. Excuse me, Count? Yes? There seems to be a slight problem. Evan leaned his head into the carriage, speaking, which made Alone tilt his head in confusion. He nodded slightly and stepped down from the carriage, where he was greeted by a knight with an overly confident expression. The knight had red hair and a lion crest on his chest, exuding an air of arrogance. As Alone looked at him curiously, the knight spoke. Are you Count Palacio? That's correct. Though they had never met, the knight spoke informally, as if the facial expressions in this fantasy world were enough to reveal a person's personality. As Alone replied, Evan leaned in to whisper into his ear. That knight seems to be a disciple of Fiola. Fiola? Yes, you know, the fourth sword. At Evan's words, Alone finally let out a low murmur of realization. A master knight known as the fourth sword, Fiola, came to Alone's mind, and though he nodded, he still wore a puzzled expression. So why is the disciple of the fourth sword here, and with a whole group of knights? As Alone glanced around, he noticed several other knights wearing the same lion crest as Fiola. What business do you have with me? Turning back to Fiola's disciple, Alone asked. The knight, who had been leisurely walking toward him with a smirk, finally introduced himself. First of all, I'm Violin, a direct disciple of Sir Fiola. And? I've heard that my friend owes you a small debt. Friend? When Alone asked, Violin smiled and continued. Yes, a friend. I don't recall having any significant connections here in Caliban. My friend doesn't have any particular ties to Caliban either. He's from the kingdom of Ashkelon. At those words, Alone instinctively muttered, Ashkelon Kingdom. Huh! But then he quickly remembered and let out a low, understanding sigh. Carmine? That's right, you remember? He contacted me. Hearing Violin's words, Alone couldn't hide his disbelief. Wait, I didn't do anything to that guy. Wait, how long has it been? A few weeks? For a moment, Alone was impressed by the petty thug Carmine running to his friends to complain within just over 2 weeks. I also owe him a bit, so I have to at least make an appearance. So you've been waiting here all this time just to make that appearance? To be precise, I've been waiting for word. All carriages from the kingdom of Asteria pass through this gate. Alone felt a wave of dizziness at Violin's nonchalant words, as if apologizing for the inconvenience, but not really meaning it. Even though nobility's influence diminishes significantly in foreign lands, it wasn't to the extent that one would be treated like this at the gates. So, what's your plan? I'll give you 2 choices. Those valuable-looking goods in your carriage, how about gifting them all to us? And the other choice? Spend about 3 weeks in the underground dungeon. You're well aware that I'm a noble from another country, aren't you? Alone asked, knowing that imprisoning a foreign noble without cause would undoubtedly cause trouble. I am Sir Fiola's only direct disciple. Violin's next words left Alone dumbfounded. What Violin was essentially saying was, I can cause a ruckus, and because of my status, I'll face no consequences. The ridiculous part was that Violin's statement held some truth. Here, Alone was merely a foreign noble, but Violin was the sole direct disciple of a master knight. Unbelievable, birds of a feather really do flock together. Alone sighed, realizing that this bunch of thugs were perfectly matched for each other. Just as Alone sighed, Violin gave a wicked smile. But to be honest, no matter which option you choose, the result will be the same. Violin lightly tapped Alone's stomach with the hilt of his sword. After all, my friend only asked for one thing. Violin casually threatened Alone. Evan, who had been silent until now, slowly began to scowl. He instinctively reached for the sword at his waist when, Ha ha! A voice called out from behind, causing both Alone and Violin to turn their heads. There, Alone saw him. Deus Macallion. Dressed in black iron armor, wearing a cold expression, Deus was walking toward them. The moment he appeared, the atmosphere at the gate grew heavy, as if the air itself was weighed down. Despite the fact that it was just one person arriving, the soldiers straightened their postures, eyes wide in shock. Even the knights, who had been wearing relaxed expressions moments ago, now stood upright, their faces tense. Attention! The soldiers, who had been casually observing the situation, immediately raised their swords in salute upon seeing Deus. But he didn't spare them a glance. We greet the great sword! The knights of Violin's group, Yuzan, shouted in reverence, but Deus ignored them as well. Instead, he walked directly toward Alone. Seeing this, Violin hurriedly pulled back the sword he had pointed at Alone, trying to speak, but... Crash! Gah! Deus's hand shot out and grabbed Violin by the throat. What? Violin quickly reached for Deus's hand in protest, but... What do you think you're doing? At those cold words, Violin's face turned pale as he struggled to breathe, his eyes wide with fear. How dare you lay a hand on my benefactor? Chapter 26. Delmin, known as Caliban's master knight and the third of the 5 great swords, was in a very good mood. This was because, on this recent expedition, he had killed Klakan, one of the 8 chiefs, and rumored to be quite strong among them. Of course, the method he used to kill Klakan was something that neither Caliban nor the barbarians would ever acknowledge. He had challenged Klakan to a duel, then, when Klakan came out alone, Delmin used hidden soldiers, various traps, and poison to kill him. Even though Caliban and the barbarians were at war, they always respected each other's honor in battle, making Delmin's actions outrageously dishonorable. However, instead of feeling guilty for his deceit, Delmin smiled with the thought that he no longer had to give up his third position to Deus, one of the newly entered 5 swords. With that thought, he slaughtered all the barbarians who were present at the scene, leaving no one alive. This would have been impossible for him alone, but the numerous soldiers he had stationed outside, so they wouldn't witness the duel, made it achievable. Delmin had successfully earned merit, and now all that was left was to return and report his accomplishments. As he made his way back to one of Caliban's forward bases, he saw something that stopped him. He saw it. A man with red hair matching the symbolic power of fire stood with a tense expression. He and his red flame knights were staring at the base, or what used to be the base. The place had become a wasteland. The gray earth was smeared with red blood, ruins lay scattered, and thousands of corpses littered the ground as if they were nothing. However, what drew all their attention wasn't the ruins but the man standing in the middle of it all. Wearing the barbarian's signature leather clothing, he stood proudly at the center of the ruined base. As Delmin turned to look at him, the man also turned his gaze towards Delmin and started walking toward him. At a glance, it seemed like the man was inviting his own death, as Delmin had not only 100 knights but also countless soldiers by his side. No matter how strong this barbarian chieftain was, he couldn't handle such a large force alone. Yet, despite recognizing the overwhelming odds, Delmin's expression was filled with tension. The first reason was the state of the base, now reduced to ruins, and the second was the aura. Although Delmin had committed a dishonorable act, he was still a sword master, someone who could cut off a mountain peak with a single slash and claim the lives of dozens of barbarians with one stroke. And as such, he could clearly sense the extraordinary aura emanating from this man. And then, "Are you Delman?" The man's voice echoed, a voice that didn't sound human, and just hearing it for a moment shook Delman to his core. Delman quickly regained his composure and instinctively raised his aura blade as he responded. "Who are you? Then answer me, Delman. Why did you desecrate the sacred and honorable duel? What? Answer me. Why did you sully the great and holy duel, the honorable fight between two warriors? Speak." Hearing the barbarian's words, Delman realized that the man was talking about his duel with Klakan, and he replied, "Ha, this is a battlefield. Isn't it foolish to believe in a duel in such a place?" The barbarian stared at Delman, unfazed, and spoke again. "How dare you speak of the great duel like that?" His voice was filled with clear displeasure. "I already told you, this is a battlefield. This is your last chance, human, a warrior of considerable strength. Fight me in a duel. If you win, I will let you go." At the barbarian's offer of a last chance, Delman did not respond, he just. "Everyone, prepare for battle," he commanded the knights. As soon as his order was given, the knights and soldiers swiftly drew their weapons in perfect unison. The Knights of the Red Flame, who had fought alongside Delman in numerous battles in the Northern War and led them to victory time and time again, all wore resolute expressions as they drew their swords and deployed their auras. Watching this scene, the barbarian muttered, as if in lamentation and disdain, "Do knights truly possess no honor?" With that muttering, creak creak, the surrounding corpses began to rise. "What is this?" The knights were startled by the sudden change, but the phenomenon continued regardless of their emotions. A knight with his head split in half. A soldier with half of his body blown away. A rider with his upper torso severed. They slowly began to awaken. And then, "It hurts, it hurts, it hurts, it hurts. Kill me, please, I beg you." The screams of the dead filled the gray earth. "You mortals, without even the honor to your name, are unnecessary in this world." That presence vanished. Even Delman, who had stepped into the realm of a superhuman, couldn't keep up with the speed. But then, however, Delman turned his gaze to the voice that had suddenly appeared, and the barbarian had already slammed his hand into the ground. Boom! The earth exploded instantly, rocks and debris shot into the sky, and simultaneously, the soldiers and knights who had been standing ready were all hurled into the air. And with just one swing of the barbarian's foot through the air, crack! The soldiers and knights flying through the sky were struck by the debris, their bodies turning into mere chunks of flesh. Without even time to scream, their remains splattered across the ground, creating countless red flowers of blood. As Delman belatedly tried to swing his sword, he realized in that moment, his arm was gone. Aarg! Delman's scream echoed, and the soldiers who hadn't yet grasped the situation finally understood what had happened. In just an instant, the Master Knight and most of his knightly order had been annihilated. Panic spread like a plague among the soldiers, robbing them of their will. Ah! The terror rooted in their hearts quickly spread, leaving them paralyzed. In the chaos of the massacre, Delman, who had lost his arm, looked at the barbarian in disbelief. Who are you?" The barbarian, no, the god of all barbarians and the father of duels, Altultus, crushed Delman's internal organs with his rough hands, finishing his task. He looked down at Delman, who lay beneath his hand. A moment later, "It hurts, it hurts, it hurts, it hurts." Though his internal organs were completely shattered, Delman rose again, spewing blood across the gray snowfield and screaming in agony like the others. Satisfied, Altultus grinned as he spoke. "All you gathered barbarians?" He turned his gaze to the surviving soldiers, who were frozen in terror. "Prove yourselves through a duel. And then, prove that you are not savages." He offered them a duel. "If you do, I shall grant you an honorable death." On the blood-stained Colosseum made of the dead, Master Knight and disciple of the Fourth Sword, Violin, couldn't understand the current situation. The reason he had come here today was simply to help out his friend, Carmine, who was also a very valuable supplier, by taking care of a certain noble from the kingdom of Asteria. Of course, given that the 6 kingdoms were united under the Union Kingdom, normally, even if the noble was from another country, he should have shown some level of courtesy. A misstep could quickly turn into an international issue. However, the reason Violin had accepted Carmine's request without hesitation wasn't just because of the item Carmine had offered. After considering the circumstances, Violin thought there was no chance the situation would escalate. There were 3 reasons for his judgment. The first was that, among the 6 kingdoms in the Union, Caliban, which constantly fended off the barbarians from the north, held the most influence. The second was that rumors about Count Palacio had yet to spread again, meaning his reputation remained that of a reckless noble who had only become a count by sheer luck, and he had no connections in Caliban. The third was that, even if the situation did go wrong, Violin believed that his master, Fiola, who stood at the pinnacle of Caliban, would somehow smooth things over. Although not as gifted as Deus, Violin was talented with the sword and had always been under his master's protection. With these 3 reasons in mind, Violin thought there would be no harm to himself in dealing with Count Palacio, and truthfully, his judgment wasn't wrong. However, there was one thing Violin didn't know. And that was... crack. Ugh! Count Palacio was, in fact, a benefactor to Deus Macallion, a master knight currently hailed as a hero in Caliban. G.H. Deus had earned the nickname, the Swordless, after defeating Kurga of the Snowfields, one of the 8 chieftains, in a duel. Ag. Violin, who was slammed into a tree, groaned with a fearful and defiant expression as he tried to speak. Wait! Lord Deus! But he couldn't finish. Deus's foot struck his stomach before Violin could open his mouth. The knights of Yuzan, who had just been showing their respect, instinctively tried to draw their swords at the sight, but the moment you draw your swords, I leave the rest to your imagination. Just by turning his gaze and saying those words, the knights swallowed their breaths in silence, and then the one-sided beating began. Watching this, alone, who stood with an outwardly expressionless face as Deus mercilessly pummeled Violin, but inwardly, he was filled with a deep, satisfied smile. You've grown up so well. Alone gazed at Deus as if he were a father watching his son grow up splendidly. Not that any father would feel proud watching his son ruthlessly beat someone else, but Alone felt something akin to paternal pride in that moment. Actually, it was more than that. He even felt a strange sense of gratitude. Alone had been thinking all the way to Caliban that Deus likely wouldn't be too fond of him. Perhaps Deus might tolerate him, but Alone had thought it would stop there, never expecting any deeper emotion. After all, Alone had never had a personal conversation with Deus, and more importantly, Deus had never written him a single letter. So, when Deus referred to him as his benefactor earlier, Alone felt as if all the effort he had put into raising Deus had finally been rewarded, and a pleased smile spread across his face. He hits well. Indeed. Watching Deus break Violin apart in real time, Alone wore a calm smile, and after about 3 minutes, he felt as if a weight had been lifted from his heart. Alone was deeply grateful to Deus for going this far. But 5 minutes later... Count! What? Isn't he going to die? Alone, sensing something was wrong, watched Deus mercilessly beat Violin, who was pathetically clinging to his legs, crying and begging for forgiveness. No way. Would he? Well, yeah. Even so, Alone kept thinking. Surely he wouldn't kill him? As he observed Deus's beating for another 5 minutes. After confirming that Violin's face was now so disfigured that it no longer resembled the cunning expression it had shown just 10 minutes earlier, Alone broke into a cold sweat and suddenly remembered. The Deus standing before him. Oh, was one of the 5 great sins. Of course, that didn't mean the feeling of gratitude had disappeared. It hadn't disappeared, but... It's nice that he went this far for me, but... Alone watched as Deus, leaving the half-crippled Violin behind, walked towards him. I'm at your service. Bowing his head as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Alone noticed the soldiers and knights murmuring at the scene. Alone thought, glancing at the blood-soaked Violin. Isn't this a bit excessive? Chapter 27. Malin, a guard working in the capital of Caliban, Kurdum, loves rumors. The reason is simple. Spending all day on duty at the city walls can be boring, and gossip is one of the ways to make his shifts more enjoyable. For that reason, Malin had been waiting for this day, or more precisely, for the day Count Palacio would arrive. He had heard a secret rumor that the troublemaker, who ran wild under the shadow of his master, had asked to be summoned as soon as Count Palacio arrived. Malin didn't know why that troublemaker was seeking out a count from another country, but he knew what would happen next. After all, there was only one reason that troublemaker ever sought someone out. Thanks to this, Malin was expecting a highly entertaining spectacle once Count Palacio arrived. However, what he saw was far from what he had expected. It wasn't Count Palacio who was being beaten, but Violin, and the one assaulting him was none other than Deus. Deus, one of the master knights of Caliban, had risen to the top of the knightly order in less than a year with unmatched talent, earning the title of Mukin, Swordless. It was Deus who had struck Violin. Even that was enough to shock everyone in the capital, where rumors spread like wildfire in a single day. But Malin was even more stunned by what happened next. The Swordless bowed his head. Malin stared, mouth agape, at Deus bowing his head as he spoke. Did Sir Swordless just bow his head? The Swordless. The guards around him were equally shocked. The reason for their disbelief was simple. Until now, Deus had never bowed to anyone in Caliban, except for the current king. There was even an incident where he slapped the second prince 3 times for harassing his only sister, an event still talked about in the capital. Deus's reputation soared after that, even though the second prince was known as a troublemaker abandoned by the royal family. Despite committing an offense against royalty, Deus wasn't punished, further elevating his status. It essentially meant that the entire kingdom of Caliban regarded Deus Macallion as more important than the second prince, and his reputation only grew stronger. Yet here he was, bowing his head to a mere count from another country. Please get in. Seeing Deus bowing to Count Palacio was enough to shock anyone familiar with the rumors. Soon, all eyes were on the count, who walked without expression, escorted by the master knight, as if this situation didn't faze him at all. And then, who exactly is this Count Palacio, that the Swordless would bow to him? Malin and everyone who saw the Count's face had the same question on their minds, their mouths hanging open in astonishment. This situation is strange, but why are they looking at me like that? Alone, the one receiving these shocked stares, felt puzzled by the situation. Please get in. He then turned his gaze at Deus's words and noticed the carriage waiting for him. It stands out. Unlike other carriages, it was painted entirely in black, making it impossible to miss. And thud! Surrounded by knights as if they were guarding it like a fortress, Alone started to understand why people were staring at him this way. Even he thought this was a bit too much. Got it. However, it would be ridiculous to refuse to ride the carriage at this point, so Alone quietly got in. I will take care of the carriage then, said Evan, ending the conversation as Alone, now in the carriage with Deus, headed toward the mansion under the escort of the Black Knights. A short while later. Is this a mansion? Seeing Deus's mansion for the first time, Alone was visibly surprised. He had heard that Caliban's capital was large compared to other kingdoms, but this was the first time he'd seen a mansion of such immense size. Is this what success looks like? Alone briefly mused as he followed Deus, who led the way from the carriage through the vast mansion towards the office. Once inside the office. Please have a seat. Alone looked slightly puzzled as Deus offered him the seat of honor without hesitation. Even though Alone had little knowledge of formal etiquette, he knew the basics. Isn't the owner supposed to sit in the seat of honor? Of course, if Alone were of a higher rank, things might be different, but he was only a count, and not even a noble of Caliban, but from the kingdom of Asteria. In short, there was no need for Deus to treat him with such excessive courtesy. From Alone's perspective, Deus's treatment made him feel like a proud father whose son had made a great success. He felt pleased but also slightly concerned. He had quite a few favors to ask Deus. Clearing his throat, Alone sat in the seat of honor, and Deus naturally sat beside him. A heavy silence followed. What should I talk about? Of course, there were many things Alone needed to ask for, but he knew that communication doesn't work that way. First, he needed to make some small talk. But having never spoken to Deus face to face, let alone exchanged letters, Alone felt awkward. Just as he was struggling with the silence. "Creak. I'm a bit late." Evan, guided in by the knights, cautiously entered the room, and Alone realized that Evan had brought a gift. "Evan, the gift." "Understood." At Alone's command, Evan placed the gift on Deus's desk. "This is a gift." At Deus's response, Alone let out a small sigh. He had been wondering how to start the conversation, and now the gift had given him a way in. "Thank you." Deus bowed his head slightly to Alone. And then, silence. "Alright, isn't this the part where the conversation naturally follows?" The thought passed through Alone's mind, and he finally opened his mouth. "Aren't you going to open the gift?" "It would be improper to open it now. I'll do so later." Alone understood that it was indeed rude to open a gift in front of a high-ranking person with too much excitement. But Alone wasn't a high-ranking noble himself. What exactly does he think of me? Alone's confusion was apparent, but his bewilderment didn't last long. Because... Creak! Brother! Before he could gather his thoughts, a young girl entered Deus's office. Like Deus, she had striking purple eyes. She glanced around the room before her gaze settled on Evan. "Oh! Brother Evan!" Recognizing him, she greeted him with a familiar smile. "Oh, silly!" Evan also smiled warmly as he stood up, and Alone quickly realized that the girl was Deus's younger sister, whom Evan had been sent to rescue. They do look alike. In the game's Psychedelia, only the tragic circumstances of her death were described, so Alone had never seen her appearance. Yet, now that he saw her in person, he couldn't help but nod in agreement at the strong resemblance. As he turned his gaze to Deus, Alone was startled. Deus had a distinctly displeased expression on his face. When Silly grabbed Evan's hand, his eyes grew even sharper. "Silly, Evan is not your brother. He's an old man," Deus remarked. Watching this, Alone quickly realized how protective Deus was of his sister. In short, it was safe to call him a Siscon. Though Alone understood Deus's attachment, knowing from the game that he had suffered a great sense of loss and lack of family, it was still amusing. As Alone was thinking about this, Silly, who had been playing with Evan moments before, suddenly came over to Alone and spoke cheerfully. "You're Count Palacio, right?" "That's correct. I heard from Evan. You gave the order to save me." Hearing this, Alone glanced at Deus, then nodded quietly. "I just did my duty. If you died, your brother could have turned into a continental killing machine." "Thank you so much," Silly said, bowing deeply. Seeing her heartfelt gratitude warmed Alone's heart. Even though his actions had been motivated by other intentions, receiving sincere thanks for his good deeds felt rewarding. Alone smiled slightly. After Silly left, the atmosphere relaxed a little. Alone cleared his throat, glancing at Deus, who still wore a subtly hostile expression toward Evan after his sister's departure. "Deus, the reason I've come to see you is that I need a favor." "A favor?" Deus asked, looking slightly confused. "Yes. Is there something strange about that?" Alone responded with equal confusion. "No, nothing. Please, go ahead." Though Deus's words seemed a little odd, Alone paused for a moment. He found it hard to speak now that it was time to make his request. He had 2 favors to ask of Deus, and both were likely to be somewhat difficult. After hesitating, Alone finally spoke up with the first request. "I need to go to the north. Could you accompany me?" "Of course." Alone blinked, surprised at how easily Deus agreed. "Is it really that simple?" "Yes, I was planning a northern expedition anyway." Hearing this, Alone felt relieved. The first request, at least, turned out to be relatively easy. Taking a deep breath of relief, Alone made his second request. "Could I borrow the ring of the Arrogant One from the Caliban royal treasury?" As he made this request, Alone watched Deus carefully. After all, asking to borrow something from the royal treasury was essentially like indebting oneself to the royal family, and it could be quite a tricky matter for Deus. No matter how powerful Deus was, he was still bound by the political interests of the kingdom of Caliban. However, the ring of the Arrogant One was essential for Alone's plan, and he had to ask, even if it put Deus in an awkward position. Of course, I don't want this to cause you any trouble. Alone began, trying to soften the request and offer compensation, but... Understood. Deus interrupted. What? I will retrieve the ring of the Arrogant One right away. Deus bowed slightly as he spoke, leaving Alone bewildered once again. Wait, this is good, but is it really okay? With a slightly dazed expression, Alone asked. You know where it is, right? I've heard it's in the royal treasury of Caliban. And isn't it a bit difficult to get it? It usually takes about a week by normal means, but if you wish, I can retrieve it immediately. Is there a way to do that? Curious about Deus's bold claim, Alone inquired. Deus paused for a moment, seeming to consider something, then replied. The king might be a bit troublesome, but I can handle about 50 people, so it shouldn't be too difficult. Huh! Evan, who was nearby, was visibly taken aback, and though Alone didn't show it as openly, he was just as baffled by Deus's unwavering determination. Is this his way of showing how far he's willing to go for me? Interpreting Deus's words as a sign of his loyalty, Alone hesitated before saying, No, there's no need to go that far. Understood. I will retrieve the ring as quickly as possible. Deus looked somewhat disappointed as he agreed. Alone, for a brief moment, thought, I just wanted you to borrow it, but he quickly nodded in response. He really cares about me, but isn't this a bit much? And with that thought, Alone spent a day at the mansion while waiting for the ring to be retrieved. I brought it. What? Alone stared at the precious jewel-encrusted box containing the ring of the Arrogant One. And then, What? Count, did you hear? Yesterday, Deus apparently caused a ruckus at the royal palace demanding the treasure. I also heard he slapped the second prince again. At Evan's report, Alone was left utterly speechless. What is going on? Alone began to realize something was off about Deus. Chapter 28. 3 days had passed since they obtained the ring of the Arrogant One and began preparing to leave for the north. By the time the knights and soldiers had finished preparing, the expedition force had already departed for the north. Not long after their departure, Deus Macallion. A man approached Deus. He had long blue hair and a vertical scar across his face. This was Fiola, one of the master knights of Caliban, known as the Fourth Sword. You laid a hand on my disciple, Fiola said, his expression cold, his eyes betraying a hidden fury. Deus, with an indifferent expression, responded, Your disciple acted rudely towards my benefactor. Ha! And that gives you the right to beat someone else's disciple senseless? Do you think it doesn't? Deus replied. Fiola frowned at Deus's words. His anger was clear on his face, and the intense energy he exuded filled the air, causing the knights around them to break out in a cold sweat. However, Deus, who took the full brunt of this power head-on, remained unfazed. You're lucky I didn't kill him, Fiola. Deus's aura turned even more ominous, emitting a terrifying purple energy that pressed down on Fiola. The tension between them was so thick that it seemed like a sword fight would break out the moment someone drew a weapon. But after a moment of silence, TCH. Fiola was the first to turn away. Clicking his tongue, he glanced at Count Palacio, who was standing behind Deus. Don't think I'm going to just let this go, Fiola said before returning to his resting battalion. Alone, watching Fiola leave, Alone thought to himself, terrifying. He felt a tingling in his hands as he subconsciously clenched and unclenched his fists. So that's a master knight for you. Just the sheer power Fiola unintentionally released had left Alone breathless. At that moment, Evan, standing nearby, muttered in disbelief. That's insane, he's a complete monster. Alone turned his gaze to Deus. Despite the overwhelming energy Fiola had directed at him, Deus showed no signs of discomfort, which reminded Alone again that Deus was a master knight as well. It wasn't that he ever forgot this fact, but Deus had been rather humble towards him recently, so seeing this side of him was a fresh reminder. Honestly, he's kind of rude to everyone else except me, Alone mused. He recalled rumors from a few days ago about Deus and thought of the time Deus had snapped at Evan, telling him, Shut up, old man. Rescuing his sister must have been the right move after all, Alone thought to himself. Initially, he hadn't understood why Deus was so obedient to him, but now it was becoming clear. In fact, he didn't even need to guess anymore. Just watching Deus around his sister was answer enough. Maybe in the future, if I call for help while running my estate, he'll come running to save me. Alone grinned at the thought, though deep down he knew Deus wouldn't go that far. He shrugged lightly and returned to his carriage. The expedition to the north continued. 2 weeks and 3 days later, the expedition force crossed the border between Caliban and the north and arrived at their first outpost. There, they received 3 pieces of news. The first was the death of Delman, the third sword, who had gone missing after news came that the eastern outpost of Caliban had fallen and the enemy appeared. The second was that Curiana, the second sword, who had been leading an advanced expedition to the western outpost, had suffered severe injuries in battle against the enemy. And the final news was, "Undead, you say?" The messenger reported that the enemy was approaching the outpost, leading an army of the undead. "Yes, the enemy has been reanimating fallen soldiers and knights into undead and marching with them." At the messenger's words, Viola let out a deep sigh and muttered, "This is troubling." Deus, hearing the same news, remained silent. If the messenger's words were true, the situation was clearly unfavorable for Caliban. The atmosphere in the meeting room was tense. Even the master knights and the nobles leading the soldiers were reluctant to speak. Finally, one of the nobles cautiously suggested, "Perhaps we should retreat?" That simple suggestion unleashed a flood of opinions from the other attendees. "Are you serious? You want us to turn our backs and run from the barbarians?" "That's not what I meant. I'm saying we should wait for a better opportunity. We're already in a bad position, and the second sword is severely injured, not to mention Reinhardt still hasn't returned from his seclusion. Do you really think we stand a chance? At this point, do you think the injured could even escape while the barbarians advance on the outpost?" The room quickly descended into chaos, but in the end, the opinions of the nobles didn't hold much weight. The true leaders of the expedition were the 2 master knights. Eventually, the nobles looked toward Viola and Deus for direction. "Let's think it over. I'll call for another meeting later. For now, everyone, take a break and clear your minds," Viola said, standing up from his seat. Deus also rose without a word and exited the tent. Outside, the land was the same dull gray as always. But to Deus, who had reached a certain level as a master knight, the world looked very different. The red snowfields. To Deus's eyes, the gray land appeared as a crimson world, filled with an eerie, ominous energy. The sky, consumed by the sinister red manna, was both beautiful and terrifying, a sight that even made someone as strong as Deus feel a faint sense of intimidation. He silently observed this strange world. After glancing at Viola, who was likely seeing the same scene, Deus turned his gaze elsewhere. There, he saw Alone, the great moon. Even though this terrifying world lay before him, Alone showed no signs of fear or awe. Instead, he sat calmly by the fire, eating a sweet potato with a blank expression. Unlike Deus, who couldn't tear his eyes away from the crimson sky, Alone hadn't glanced at the ominous landscape even once. He simply muttered to himself while eating. Diffraction, compression, focal point, annihilation. The great moon mumbled incomprehensible words as if he had seen this world countless times before, words that Deus couldn't begin to understand. Watching him, Deus felt a surge of curiosity about Alone's purpose for being in the north. Of course, Deus had a rough idea that the great moon was here to deal with the enemy, but that didn't quell all of his questions. After all, from Deus's perspective, the great moon didn't seem particularly powerful, either now nor in the past. Maybe he just can't see what I'm seeing. Deus glanced back up at the red sky. This scene was one that only those who had reached a certain level of enlightenment could see. The eerie landscape was enough to make him frown instinctively. But what if it was simply that the great moon couldn't see this scene? If that were the case, his behavior might be somewhat understandable. Just as Deus was pondering this, "Ugh, seriously, back off!" A loud, high-pitched voice suddenly caught Deus's attention. Turning to the source, he saw a knight facing off against a mage. "Please, just a little more help." You know how dire the situation is, the knight pleaded. I know that. But no matter how hard I try, I can't do anything more. I have to leave. Even so, just one more time. No. I told you, it's impossible, you idiots. The mage screamed hysterically, while the knights continued to press her. Deus easily recognized the knights by their armor. They were members of Silver Shade, the knight orders serving the second sword of Caliban, Kiriana. Opposite them stood Pinia, the deputy tower master of the Blue Tower. Dragged out here for research when I have so much work to do. Why won't they just leave me alone? Pinia complained. But shouldn't saving lives come first? The knight insisted. I'm telling you, I've done everything I can. There's nothing more I can do. I'm not refusing out of laziness. I've already done all I can. Watching the tantrum of Pinia, the young prodigy of the magic world who had reached the 6th rank at a young age, Deus felt a moment of confusion, but quickly understood. He remembered that the Caliban outpost was working in collaboration with mages from the Blue Tower to research the barbarians' rituals. Deputy Tower Master, huh? She's strong, Deus thought, noting the remarkable energy emanating from her. As Pinia continued pushing the knights aside in frustration, she noticed Deus standing in her path. She scowled and was about to speak. What are you? But froze before she could finish. Deus raised an eyebrow, confused by her sudden silence. But then he realized that she wasn't looking at him, but at someone behind him. Why? Pinia's trembling voice broke the tense air, and terror filled her eyes as if she had seen something that shouldn't exist. Her body subtly shook, and Deus instinctively followed her gaze. Standing there was Alone, who had just been munching on a sweet potato a moment ago. Now, he was staring back at Deus and Pinia with a puzzled expression. A brief moment passed and then... It's been a while, Deputy Tower Master. Alone greeted calmly. Yes, hello. Pinia stammered, suddenly acting like a scared kitten, her head lowered, all traces of her previous hysteria gone. How have you been? Alone asked. I've been well. Watching Pinia, whom Deus had previously regarded as a powerful figure, now cowering like a stray cat, he couldn't help but be baffled. Was I simply ignorant all this time? Deus thought, quietly reflecting on his understanding of the situation. Chapter 29. Most of the members of the Eclipse Order, led by Deus Macallion, supported Alone. However, they acted that way solely because Alone was considered Deus's benefactor. In reality, their feelings toward Alone were close to indifference. To the Knights of the Eclipse, Alone wasn't particularly special, aside from being Deus's benefactor. Even if there were emotions involved, it was only due to the jealousy some young knights felt when they saw how Deus treated Alone. Other than that, there were hardly any feelings toward him at all. In short, the knights didn't hold particularly positive sentiments toward Alone. But at least for this moment. Vice Tower Master, may I ask you a favor? Yes. What kind of favor? The knights could only stare blankly, mouths agape. Could you make a potion of Levidian? Remedian's potion? Yes. Can you do it? Yes, of course. Absolutely. Not only the Knights of Eclipse but even the Silver Knights, who were just recently berated by Pinia, were shocked. This was because they knew that the Vice Tower Master in front of them had a personality as eccentric as her genius magical abilities. In fact, it wasn't just them. Any knight who had ever gone on an expedition to the north would have heard stories of the hysteric Pinia. When heading north, wizards from the Blue Tower, who were often summoned at the same time, would always complain about Pinia's unbearable personality, so it was impossible not to know. Thus, the knights, aware of Pinia's notorious character, were even more astonished. Just to check, do you happen to have or know how to make the elixir of exceptionality? I don't have it, but I think I could make it. Could you also make that for me? Well, it takes a lot of time, and I have other things to do. I really need it. I'll do it. I promise I will. The knights couldn't believe what they were seeing. Pinia, the Vice Tower Master of the Blue Tower, and a 6th-ranked wizard, was obediently following the Count of Palacio's orders. No, more than obediently, she was contorting herself to avoid upsetting him in any way. The knights found it utterly unbelievable. And of course, what the hell? The same went for the wizards who had been dispatched from the Blue Tower with Peenia, enduring her constant scolding and shedding tears of blood from the torment. What is this? Am I seeing things? Has the Vice Tower Master completely lost it? The wizards, who looked on as if they were witnessing the end of the world, gasped in disbelief. She refused to make that last time because it was too difficult and spent weeks complaining, but now she's willing to make it. Am I seeing this wrong? Did someone cast an illusion spell as a joke? Are you stupid? If someone had cast an illusion spell, they'd have to cast silence on the Vice Tower Master as well, and who has that kind of spare magic power? They were so shocked that they even subtly tried to dispel any lingering magic, thinking perhaps another wizard was playing a trick. And then, thank you? No, it's something I should do. How much payment will you need? Payment, you mean? It's only natural to pay for the favor I've asked. Just tell me, and I'll have it sent to the magic tower later. Oh, well. However, if it's a bit expensive, the payment might be delayed. The finances haven't been great lately. Just give me 1 gold coin. 1 gold coin? Isn't that too cheap? No, it's fine. Yes, it's totally fine. Well then, I won't refuse such a generous offer. As they watched Peenia, who was smiling and accepting just 1 gold coin for 2 potions that normally cost hundreds of gold coins to make, both the knights and the wizards wore blank expressions. They soon all turned their gazes toward Alone. The knights' faces were filled with amazement, while a look of reverence appeared on the wizards' faces. It seems like there's some misunderstanding, but at least I got the potions easily, Alone thought, as he returned to Evan. Wait, Count, when did you start speaking informally with the Vice Tower Master? HM? I'm a noble, so I just spoke informally. No way. Excuse me? But as far as I know, the Vice Tower Master is treated as a quasi-noble, and it's standard etiquette to speak formally to each other. Is that so? Yes. Realizing that he had been somewhat rude to Peenia, Alone let out a quiet sigh. With this, I've gathered all the cards I need to play. Not long after, Alone obtained the Levidian's potion and the elixir of exceptionality from Peenia. A few hours later, he heard Deus's words. Retreat? Yes. Deus began explaining the current situation, and Alone nodded slightly as he listened. It's true, they don't seem capable of fighting. Alone recalled the many injured soldiers and the expressions of terror on their faces when he had arrived at the forward base. The knights looked relatively fine, but their expressions weren't good either. The only people walking around with calm expressions were the wizards, who were here to investigate the ritual, not to fight. As for the wizards, they already fled. Alone glanced around. Unlike earlier, when the area was bustling with wizards, there were none to be seen since Peenia had delivered the potions. Realizing that the wizards had already hit the escape button after sensing the danger at the forward base, Alone heard Deus's question. What do you intend to do? Without hesitation, Alone replied. I will stay here. The reason Alone had brought so many items to Caliban, including borrowing the ring of the Arrogant One from the royal family, was to deal with the Outer God. Without dealing with the Outer God, the future he foresaw would be nothing but a disaster. As Alone was reviewing the plans in his mind, Wawa! Suddenly, a terrible scream came from the distance. He immediately stood up and rushed outside the tent. There, he saw a wizard screaming wildly, along with other wizards fleeing frantically toward the forward base. And then, behind them, the undead were approaching. It's the undead! Ah! The soldiers screamed, as if recalling a recent nightmare, and gathered at the entrance with their swords drawn. The knights, too, began to ready their weapons as confusion and fear spread across their faces. Despite the sudden chaos, Alone quickly grasped what had happened. A raid. Realizing that the Outer God had moved even faster than the fleeing wizards anticipated, Alone's thoughts came to a halt as, Everyone, draw your swords! With Fiola's urgent shout from the barracks, the battle began. The undead who charge in blindly without any tactics or strategy are far inferior in combat strength compared to a well-trained army. Even if the necromancers of this continent were to raise the undead through necromancy, they could never overcome well-trained soldiers. However, "Please save me!" Ak. This unit of undead was fundamentally different from those controlled by ordinary necromancers. "Die! Just die! Please!" The soldiers thrust their spears into the undead. Some aimed for the heart, others the head, and some targeted the legs. The soldiers' spears pierced various parts of the undead bodies. If these were corpses raised by a necromancer, the damage inflicted would have been so severe that they should have already ceased to function. But, even with spears lodged in their bodies, the undead continued to advance. The sight of them walking forward with spears still embedded was more than enough to instill terror in the soldiers. Squelch! Grk! A soldier instantly died, his throat pierced by the sword of an undead. The situation became even more dire as the undead immediately attacked the soldier next to him. The seed of fear planted in the soldier's instincts was more than ready to bloom. Their formation crumbled, and in an instant, the battlefield descended into chaos. This, in turn, increased the number of deaths, which only led to more undead rising from the fallen, creating the worst kind of vicious cycle. Yet, despite the grim situation, the soldiers gritted their teeth, their bloodshot eyes wide open as they continued to fight. Why? Because they still had hope. The knights, wielding ore-infused weapons, were quickly cutting down the overwhelming numbers of undead, reducing them by the thousands. The wizards, who had joined the battle later, were eliminating the undead even faster than the knights. Among them, the magic unleashed by Penia was particularly astounding. Icicle! Crack! Crash, crash, crash! Her magic was nothing short of extraordinary. Hundreds of undead advancing toward the soldiers were instantly frozen and shattered into pieces, a truly magnificent spectacle. However, even more than Penia, the figures that filled the soldiers with hope were the two master knights present, Fiola and Deus. Of the two, Deus's presence was especially overwhelming. SSSHT. Dozens of undead surrounded him. Some were soldiers with large wounds on their heads, others were knights with gaping holes in their chests. But, in an instant, the hundreds of undead around Deus suddenly halted, as if time itself had stopped. And then, swish! With a single light horizontal sweep of Deus's sword, all the frozen undead were precisely cut in half. One strike. Hundreds of bodies. An overwhelming display of superhuman strength that brought hope to the eyes of the soldiers and knights. But just then, boom! With a deafening explosion, the outer god descended in the middle of the battlefield. For a moment, the movements of the undead halted, and the eyes of the soldiers shifted toward the new arrival. The sheer overwhelming presence of the outer god filled the battlefield, and even Deus and Fiola couldn't hide the tension that appeared in their eyes. As the ashen dust cleared, revealing the figure of a man, everyone held their breath. Though he wore the clothing of the barbarians, his form had transcended anything that could still be called human. His massive physique and blue skin indicated that this being had long left the bounds of humanity. And then, "Barbarian, do not defile the sins of those who do not know honor." With that, the voice of Ulthultus echoed, and the undead began to rise again. The bodies that had been shattered into pieces by Penia started to mend, fusing together like slime and regenerating their physical forms. The corpses that had been severed by Deus's sword also began to reform. In that moment, SSSHT. Fiola, who had been silent until just moments before, suddenly appeared right in front of the outer god. His sharp instinct led him to realize that the tide of the battle had shifted the moment the undead resurrected, and they could no longer secure victory. As one of the fastest master knights of Caliban, possessing the power of divine speed, he struck before Ulthultus could even react. Thunk! Fiola's sudden strike pierced Ulthultus's heart. But only the tip of his sword had managed to penetrate. Ulthultus's gaze shifted toward Fiola, filled with contempt. Barbarians know no honor. Those who do not uphold honor abandon their very existence. Furthermore, crack! They also forsake the nobility of the soul. Thud! Fiola's body, which had just been gripping the sword, collapsed to the ground. His head was no longer attached to his body. However, There is no honorable death for those who disregard all value. With these words, Fiola's headless body began to twitch and rise, convulsing as it stood up once again. Seeing this horrifying spectacle, everyone present understood the grim reality. This battle was lost. Fear spread across the soldiers' faces, and despair began to take hold on the faces of the knights and wizards alike. Even Pinia and Deus, who had far surpassed the limits of ordinary humans, were not immune to this despair. In fact, they had felt it even earlier than the others. With their heightened awareness, they knew that the being before them possessed far greater power than they had anticipated. As cries of agony and despair echoed from the undead, they were consumed by hopelessness, except for one man. O mighty god of duels, Althaltus! While everyone else was sinking into despair, a single man began walking toward the giant, passing between the living and the undead. Step, step. Neither slow nor fast. In accordance with the great oath of Calgunius. The face of the man walking toward the giant remained calm, even amidst this hellish scene of despair. As if he had been through such an experience countless times. And that man. I, alone Palatio, in the name of the great oath. The Count of Palatio. Demand a duel of Babylonia. With a swirl of his wrist, Alone raised his arm, and a bracelet glowing with a deep grey light shone as he stood face to face with the giant. Chapter 30. All eyes were focused on Count Palatio. The terrified soldiers. The despairing knights. Even Pinia and Deus. The giant standing before him. The giant's expressionless eyes looked at Alone, and Alone's emotionless eyes returned the gaze. Then, a smile crept across the giant's lips. Ha 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 ha. The giant's laughter echoed through the entire space as if it would crush everything. The ground shook, and the laughter was so powerful that even the dead, who sang of despair, closed their mouths. Most of the living thought the giant's sudden laughter was filled with mockery and contempt, but contrary to their thoughts. Good. Very good. Oh, noble one! The giant's laughter was filled with genuine sincerity, joy, and exhilaration. The atmosphere around the giant's body shifted. From contempt to joy, from joy to ecstasy. And then, I, Althaltus, will accept your duel under the Great Pact. At the giant's cry, the dead who sang of despair began to move in unison, forming a massive circle around Althaltus and Alone. Drip, drip. The blood that flowed from the dead soaked the ground, marking its boundary. Thus, a blood-red Colosseum was formed. In the arena of ashes decorated by bloodshed. Under the Great Pact, until the duel is over, no one may interfere with this sacred battle. As soon as the declaration was made, the bodies of the dead exploded, creating a blood-red wall. With that, a thick smile appeared on Althaltus's face. It was a clear expression of delight. However, in contrast, Alone's face remained utterly emotionless. But, I want to go home. Behind his impassive face, Alone was trembling with desperate fear. No matter how many times he reminded himself, the reason Alone came to the north was to kill the outer god Althaltus standing before him. For that, Alone had prepared everything he needed to face the god ever since hearing of the god's awakening. Now all that remained was to carry it out. Yet, despite being fully prepared, Alone's mind was filled with fear from the overwhelming pressure emanating from the god, far beyond his imagination. Stay calm. Even though he had taken the elixir of exceptionality, which was supposed to stabilize his mental state, Alone barely managed to soothe his restless heart, but unlike his emotionless face, his heart began to pound uncontrollably. It wasn't just the instinctive pressure the god exuded. There was one thing that differed from his expectations. Why has the manifestation process advanced so much already? All outer gods, once they descend, take time to adapt to reality, and eventually complete the process of becoming a wise god. Althaltus should have been no different. And yet, despite this, Althaltus's manifestation had progressed faster than expected. Though there should have been about a month remaining, the outer god before him was already close to becoming a complete wise god. It was clear to see. This rapid progress in manifestation was a factor Alone had not anticipated. The closer a god gets to becoming a wise god, the stronger they become. But more curious still, O noble one who bloomed amid savagery, Why do you know of our pact, though you are not of this era? As Alone swallowed dryly, recalling that point, Altholthus questioned him. However, Alone no longer had the luxury to respond leisurely to his words. Can I do this? Countless doubts and confusion filled his mind. Altholthus, who had become far stronger than expected, was shaking the resolve that Alone had barely maintained with potions, but he soon shook off the negativity. From the moment he had reached this point, Alone knew there was only one path left for him to walk. As Alone sorted through his confusion and fell into silence, Altholthus, still in high spirits, smiled broadly and spoke. If you don't wish to speak, so be it. You have the right. Then, let us begin the sacred duel. As the giant's smile deepened, he raised his arm. The Duel of Babylonia. Altholthus began to step toward Alone. With each step, the ground, stained with ash and blood, echoed with noise and left footprints, yet Alone made no move. He simply stood there, waiting for the being before him. And then? Thud! Even when Altholthus reached him with a massive sound and raised his fist, Alone remained silent, merely watching. From a distance, curious voices of the living began to rise, but Alone maintained his silence, observing the giant's actions. The reason was simple. The rules. To flee or move in this situation would violate the rules of the Great Babylonian Duel, which had existed in the forgotten age of gods. There were only two rules in the Babylonian Duel. 1. The attacker and defender take turns, and the defender cannot move. 2. The one who requested the duel must yield the first attack. This turn-based style of duel meant that if Alone moved even a single step, the significance would be lost. Moreover, doing so would strip him of the chance to deal with the outer god before him. Without the restrictions of the duel, there would be no way for him to kill this god, who could effortlessly slaughter even master knights in a single strike. In other words, this duel was the only means for Alone to impose restrictions that would allow him to win. Fixation. Thus, the only thing Alone could do in this moment was defend. Muttering under his breath, a sphere appeared before Alone. Condensation. The condensed sphere focused on his left arm. Reinforcement. With the words muttered, the condensed energy in his left arm began to emit a deep light. Intensification. As he finished speaking and sealed the final gesture, Altholthus, still smiling broadly, drew back his fist. Muscles pulled back like a ballista. The gathered force began to concentrate in the drawn fist. Alone knew this technique well, because he had seen it before. With 1 second, it could shatter the ground. With 5 seconds, it could break the sky. With 10 seconds, it could overturn the world. This was the song of destruction. And then, truly impressive. Feeling great joy in following the rules of Babylonia, Altholthus smiled as everyone around them wore expressions of shock. Even though they didn't fully understand, they instinctively realized. The force in the outer god's hand was far from ordinary. At the very moment when everyone's gaze converged. O honorable one who understands the nobility of the duel! The fist was swung. With a deafening roar, everything was swept away. The ground burst open as if its shell had shattered. The air vibrated, creating a rough explosion sound. The world within the range of his punch momentarily became a vacuum. And then, boom! Following the delayed, ear-splitting explosion, gray dust scattered in all directions. This is unbelievable. They could see it. The world, utterly obliterated, with nothing left where Altholthus's fist had struck. A massive cone-shaped crater formed in the ground, and the gray sky cracked open, allowing a purple sunset to cast its light over the land. Overwhelming power. As the living, who had been staring blankly at Altholthus standing against the sunset, began to feel a mixture of despair and awe. The Count, he's still alive! What? What do you mean? Everyone's gaze shifted toward the conical space at the murmuring of one knight. And then, unbelievable! Along with the knight's low curse, they all saw it. Count Palacio, drenched in blood, was standing up. The Count's condition was far from normal. His right arm hung limply, unable to exert any strength, and the blood pouring from his body seemed to signal that his death was drawing near. Yet, despite such circumstances, Alone stood firm, staring straight at the giant without a trace of emotion. as the lotus-shaped pendant around the Count's neck turned to ashes and vanished. "The conditions have all been met," the Count's voice echoed. "I invoke the oath. The ring of the arrogant one is an item that, like the oath he originally acquired, grants power in exchange for a price. The difference in the game is that the item you obtain varies depending on whether the protagonist's class is a mage or another profession. There are two other differences. One is that unlike the oath he originally used, the ring offers 4 oaths at once. The other is that, unlike the original oath, the ring's activation condition is that the wearer must be in a near-death state. Thus, all the conditions were met. He had intentionally drawn the outer god into a duel with restrictions. He had blocked out most of the pain with the potion of Levidian. He had used the one-time artifact he acquired before stopping at Caliban, the Pendant of Reincarnation, which ensured survival no matter how grievously injured, to withstand the god's attack. He had obsessively reinforced only his left hand, holding on to the recovery potion, to force it into his mouth. And with that, he fulfilled the conditions for the oath. "I shall perform it." In the frozen moment of time, alone, having completed the oath, looked ahead. Before him stood the giant, filled with great joy, arms spread wide, unmoving. As if waiting for Alone's attack, the giant did not move an inch. Alone staggered, stretching out his unscathed left hand. "It took so long to prepare the potion of Levidian, and without it, I wouldn't have even been able to stand." A reflection uttered amidst the dull pain. Even after taking the pain-suppressing potion of Levidian and forcing the highest-grade recovery potion into his mouth, Alone's body was still broken. Unless it was an elixir, his body couldn't be instantly healed. But for now, being able to lift his left hand was enough. The giant, who revered duels, had reached the pinnacle of savagery and gained honor, would neither interfere with nor avoid Alone's attack. No matter how long it took to prepare that attack. "Hugh!" As Alone watched the magical aura spiral upward from his raised hand, twisting into a vortex, he recalled the oath he had just made and smiled faintly behind his expressionless face. The nature of the oath, requiring a great sacrifice in exchange for greater power, had made his restrictions even more severe than originally planned. Althaltus had grown stronger due to his rapid manifestation, exceeding Alone's expectations. However, now Alone was certain. This strike would reach the outer god. Crack! As the spiral of electricity began to twist with a bizarre sound, Alone muttered under his breath and recalled the 4 oaths. Refraction. The first oath. To twist the laws of the world when using magic on this frozen earth. Point. The second oath. To twist the laws of the world when using magic in a near-death state. Condensation. The third oath. To twist the laws of the world when facing a god with magic. Annihilation. The fourth oath. To twist the laws of the world when facing the great dual god Althaltus with magic. Alone looked ahead. Before him, a massive line of red lightning had formed. Thin and long. Illuminated by the purple light of the setting sun, it gleamed a deep crimson. The gray magic flowing from the bracelet on his left hand enveloped the red line of lightning like smoke. In the eyes of the knights and soldiers, Alone's figure stood against the backdrop of the sunset. In the eyes of Deus and Pinia too, eyes appeared behind Alone, etched into the sunset. With that line of silence, as Alone murmured, a blinding white flash shot toward the smiling giant. Boom! The gray land briefly regained the appearance of a pure white snowfield.